Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're joining us because today we're unpacking a seriously fascinating psychological framework. Have you ever stopped to wonder why we actually act the way we do? Like, why we sometimes just go along with things that seem totally out of character for us? Or how a completely ridiculous infomercial can somehow convince us to pull out our credit cards at 2 a.m.? Well, let's just dive right into it. We're going to decode the exact mechanics of influence. We're talking about the invisible strings that guide mammalian behavior, and more importantly, how you can start spotting them in your everyday life.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the psychology of compliance, then look at breaking behavioral scripts, the 4 rings of influence, setting the frame, and we'll wrap it all up with the classic infomercial formula.
All right, Section 1, the psychology of compliance. Let's get into it.
So, to really grasp how influence works, we first have to understand just how intensely context dictates our behavior. And honestly, there is no better or more infamous place to start than the classic Milgram experiment. Check out this incredibly tiny number, 0.07%. Before the experiment even started, psychologists got together to predict how many people would actually go through with administering the maximum electric shock to another person simply because a researcher in a lab coat told them to. Their guess? Just 0.07%. They basically assumed that anyone who would go all the way had to be a literal psychopath who actively wanted to hurt people.
But man, look at what actually happened. It is wild. While the experts expected a tiny fraction of a percent to comply, a full 100% of participants went up to 250 volts. To put that in perspective, based on amps, that is a potentially lethal shock. 100%. And a staggering 67% went all the way to the absolute end of the dial. This was not a room full of psychopaths, right? This was a room full of completely normal, everyday people whose behavior was totally hijacked by the context they were placed in.
The absolute crucial takeaway here is that context dictates what behavior is permissible. To really hammer this home, our source material shares this frankly incredible true story from 1957. A stage hypnotist was doing a comedy routine and pulled an off-duty police officer up on stage. Now, this officer had a concealed, real handgun on him. The hypnotist put him under, told the officer he was a sheriff, that he absolutely could not leave the stage, and that the audience was getting super rowdy and disrespectful. Then, he escalates the context. He tells the officer someone in the crowd is pulling a gun. Because his perception of the context was so heavily altered, the officer actually pulled his real service weapon and fired into the crowd. He wasn't a monster. The context simply dictated what his brain perceived as necessary and permissible in that exact moment.
Which leads us to Section 2, breaking behavioral scripts. If you want to truly influence someone or, understand how you are being influenced every day, you've got to understand the brain's autopilot mode. We call these behavioral scripts. These are basically the brain's predictable, energy-saving patterns for interactions we expect to happen. Think about tying your shoes or throwing on a jacket in the morning. You aren't actively thinking about every single muscle movement, right? Your brain just runs a script to save time and mental energy. Well, we do the exact same thing in our social interactions. And this brings us to a super fascinating tactic, injecting novelty to break that script. Imagine you're paying a barista at a coffee shop. The standard script is to say something harmless like, "Beautiful weather this week." The barista's brain totally predicts this. It's effortless. It takes zero attention. But what if you shatter that expected script with something totally off the wall? What if you look at them and say, "Hey, did you see that huge fight outside?" Boom. Instantly, you break their behavioral script. Their brain can no longer predict what's coming next. And in that precise moment of novelty, you generate immediate, laser-focused attention.
Moving right along to Section 3, the 4 rings of influence.
According to behavioral expert Chase Hughes, there is actually a highly specific, 4-part framework that works on literally all mammals. Seriously. Whether you're training a dolphin at a marine park or trying to win over a boardroom full of executives, this exact sequential model applies. It starts with focus. That's the sudden jolt of novelty we just talked about when you break a script. Once you have their focus, you move to ring 2 and establish authority. Next, you tap into the concept of tribe, getting them to look around at what everyone else is doing. And finally, you hack right into their deep-seated emotions and behavioral scripts. Let's zoom in a bit on that second ring, authority. How does that actually trigger the human brain? What's so interesting here is that authority is not about having a fancy job title or wearing a badge. For human beings, authority is actually made up of 5 specific behavioral traits: confidence, discipline, leadership, gratitude, and enjoyment. Exhibiting these 5 traits during that tiny little window of focus acts like a tripwire in the human brain. It unconsciously sends a massive signal to the other person saying, "Hey, I need to follow this person."
Now, the source material applies this concept to some pretty extreme real-world events to show just how simple yet devastating this kind of influence can be. When high-profile tragedies happen, like an assassination attempt or a CEO being murdered, the internet just instantly lights up with sensational theories. People immediately assume there must be Manchurian candidates, or secret injections, or some sci-fi mind control machine at work. But Hughes' analysis points to a reality that's a lot less Hollywood, but honestly, maybe a little more chilling. He argues that devastating influence doesn't actually require high-tech manipulation. Instead, it relies purely on selecting the right, susceptible target and establishing complete authority over them. If that authority is absolute enough, a simple direct command is really all it takes.
Okay, Section 4, Setting the Frame.
Let's bring this back down from those extreme edge cases and look at everyday business environments. We've all been in those meandering, passive meetings where everyone logs on, complains about having too many Zoom calls, and then just talks in circles about theoretical deals without actually getting anywhere. Well, the source suggests that instead of letting a meeting drift like that, you should volunteer a frame early on. A great way to do this is by starting with a negative constraint and then pivoting straight to a positive. Like, you could say, I am so glad we could finally meet in person because there's been way much talk about theoretical deals lately, and getting together like this gets us so much closer to a real deal. Boom. You've just completely altered the context and the entire direction of the room. So the really crucial point here is that you don't need some complex Jedi mind trick skills to be highly persuasive. The real superpower is simply being the first person in the room to volunteer a frame and actively shift the perception and context. If you can do that, you get to define exactly what behavior is expected and permissible in that space.
And that brings us to Section 5, the infomercial formula.
To prove just how incredibly effective this four-ring framework really is, let's look at a massive cultural phenomenon that has been hacking our mammalian brains for decades now. Walk through this classic infomercial timeline with me. Right at 0 seconds, the infomercial grabs your focus. Loud voice, sudden novelty, and a black and white video of someone struggling to open a jar. The script is broken and your attention is secured. At the 30-second mark, they start building authority. They flash official-looking logos and yell, "We've sold 10 million of these!" Then, at 60 seconds, they trigger tribe. You see clips of people who look exactly like you using the product and having a blast at a backyard barbecue. Unconsciously, you want to join that crowd. Finally, at 90 seconds, they hit emotion and those deep behavioral scripts.
And what is that final emotional script they always hit you with? Call now, the sale ends Sunday. It is so vital to understand that scarcity isn't just some clever sales tactic invented by marketers. It is a deeply embedded biological survival script. Out in the wild, if a pack of dogs senses their water or food supply is running out, that scarcity triggers immediate, urgent action. So an infomercial is quite literally hacking a biological survival mechanism just to get you to buy a ShamWow at 2 in the morning. It's crazy.
Well, that brings us to the end of our explainer. We have seen how powerfully context controls us, how easily our focus can be hijacked, and how simple authority and tribal triggers absolutely dictate our actions. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Take a hard look at the interactions in your life, your workplace, and your own buying habits. Whose behavioral scripts are you unconsciously following right now? Keep your eyes open out there, and I will see you in the next explainer.